Heavenly Father, we are ever thankful for your continued mercies towards us, and this though we are undeserving. We're thankful for the time you continue to take in teaching us your word and in allowing history to be a template from which we can understand prophecy. I ask forgiveness for our sins, and I thank you for this opportunity that we have to continue to learn the histories behind the rise and fall of the nations of Daniel chapter 2. And I pray that you'll open our minds and help that we will interact to the end of understanding more the histories that surround these nations. Watch over and keep us, I beg you, in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, Mr. Skinny Bones is here this week again, and he'll be with us until we go to Daniel chapter 11. And what I like about him is that he allows us to see that even when we have only the bare essentials, we have something worth contributing to the general discourses and discussions that are had within the classroom. Now, Mr. Skinnybone has progressed to the fullness of a man. We applied tissues and we applied muscles and skin to him as it relates to the nation of Babylon. But he still remains the same for the nations of Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. We are going to move on today to the Medo-Persian Empire. But before we do that, in order to do that, we would have needed to cover the rise and fall of the nation of Babylon. I'm going to allow us to recap together what we have covered about this particular nation. Your written assignment was to draw an object to represent the nation of Babylon, and beside that object you're to tell the bits of Babylon's history that interests you. I'm going to give you the opportunity of doing so right now, following us doing a recap of what we have covered so far. So the information that we have covered, there must have been something in it that interests you about the nation of Babylon. I don't know what it is, but as you think about it, if you haven't done the assignment, that's fine. You still have the opportunity of doing so now. Just go in your memory bank, recall the things we have covered, and then from what we have covered, choose from it something that you can, when you think about it, you're like, that's interesting, or that's pretty cool. I like that bit of information as it relates to the nation of Babylon. So when did Babylon rise as a nation? Hmm? 609. And when did it fall?
70 years later.
Huh?
70 years later.
70 years later, which would be? We agree with this? Yeah? Okay, it depends on this date is derived from historical facts. So if it is that you want a biblical proof for it being here, the Bible just presents the events, and history is where we get the chronology. When you look at what we have covered in the text, it tells you that in the year 625/626, there was a revolt between three nations. They were Egypt, Media. At this time, Media and Persia were not joined together as a twofold nation. And there was Babylon. The king of Assyria was in charge of the then known world. The Assyrian Empire was what was supreme then. If we look at Ezekiel, if we look at Ezekiel 31 verses 1 through to 6, we see where the Bible tells us that the Assyrian kingdom is the preceding kingdom to Babylon. And if we look at Isaiah 23 verse 13, we see that it is through the Assyrian nation that Babylon even attained world dominance. And how this happened was through the history of 626/625. When this revolt happened, the king of Assyria sent Nebuchadnezzar's father, what's his name? He sent Nabopolassar as a general to subdue Babylon and bring it back under Assyrian rule. And when he did that and proved successful, the king of Assyria dubbed him King of Babylon. And through that position, Nabopolassar maximized on the opportunities he had towards world dominance. And there were a series of events that happened. You have 612. There was another revolt between these same entities. But he who was at the helm of this revolt was Nabopolassar, the very individual that was instituted by Assyria to quell the revolt of the past. So he became the ringleader for the second revolt of 612, which began the downward spiral of the Assyrian nation. And all these information is in our text. And then you have the event of 609, the Battle of Carchemish, where King Josiah died. And from this point onward, Babylon was the premier kingdom of Bible prophecy beginning at that time. But in total, Babylon, its entire history from 625 to 538 is 88 years. But the Bible only reckons 70 of those years as its premier years of reign. Okay, so we have those bits of information spanning from 625 to 538. What other bits of information do we want to jot down for the kingdom of Babylon? We have account of its rise and we have accounts of its fall. Can you give details about those dates? Mm-hmm.
Fall, that's when they were taken over by Medo-Persia.
Okay, so the fall, Medo-Persia is responsible for that. Anything else?
So also during that, right after the beginning of Babylon being introduced, you have them coming and taking over Israel, taking the children captive and taking children back to Babylon.
Okay, so the history of 606 is what you're referencing here?
Yeah.
What happened in the year 606? BC, all these dates are BCs. What happened in 606? In Daniel's captivity. This is Daniel chapter 1, the beginning verses. Okay? And this spans another 70 years. That ends when? 536 BC. And what happened 536 BC?
Darius and Cyrus came in.
Cyrus what?
That's the time of the end. They're both times of the end. 538 and 536 are.
Uh-huh.
First decree.
The first decree. Any other bits of history you want to insert? I always do that. I'm sorry. I don't know why I always do that. And I hate seeing it when I'm back home watching videos and seeing spelling errors. It stops me. I'm like, why don't they just erase it? Yes, Cheryl?
I don't remember all the ins and outs of it, but the marriage relationships were like intriguing to me. Like, so they were like related, interrelated.
Oh, you want to cover the interesting parts, but we'll do that after we have gotten enough of the histories of Babylon. How many kings in total did Babylon have during this span of history, particularly from 625 to 539/538? How many? 7 kings. So they have had 7 kings in total. And what are the similarities that are shared between the first kings and the second and the last kings? God declaring the end from the beginning. What do we see within the beginning that is shared within the end? Co-regency. So you have co-regency at the beginning. And at the end you have a co-regency. And this co-regency is between father, son, father, son. Father, son at the beginning was Nabopolassar and who? And Nebuchadnezzar. Whoa. Okay. And at the end, Belshazzar. What's his father's name? Nabonidus. So at the beginning you have a co-regency and at the end you have a co-regency. And these are just similarities that are shared between the beginning and end of the kingdom of Babylon. So with its rise you had a co-regency and with its fall you had the same. Any additional information you want to add to this?
The kings, you have the kings of Israel taken captive in the same time.
So the 7 kings of Babylon. Though Manasseh wasn't taken by Babylon. What about the predictions that were made in the book of Isaiah about the fall that Babylon was to receive? And how the history spans from 60 plus to over 100 years. And who did we say in Sunday's class we shared a bit of information about the death of Isaiah? Who we said is responsible for killing Isaiah? Manasseh. And I was sharing the thought, this is my personal thought, is that even before Babylon was a superpower, God predicted its fall. And one of the things that I've found is that I use that tendency of God when it comes to prophetically significant nations of the Bible to understand what's going to happen with the United States of America, because the United States of America is just as important as any of the other prophetic nations. And we know the United States of America to be a prophetic nation based on Revelation chapter 13, as well as Revelation chapter 17. And one of the new dynamics I particularly enjoyed about class yesterday was where Parminder, in his line, the last line he did and said we needed to develop that thought, where he had Thyatira and Europe, and then them coming out and going from Europe to the United States of America. So even within the context of the churches, we see the role of the United States of America. Anything else you want to add to what we have on the board? We have the rising date. Well, this is similar to Daniel 11 verse 31, I believe it is, where Rome reigns for a time. And it's not that Rome was not on the global scene. It's just that world dominance was not his until that period of time, the Battle of Actium, which happened in 31 AD. So similarly, we know that Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, well, Nabopolassar chiefly, was in charge of Babylon for many years before Babylon became a superpower. And the bulk of the years when Babylon was in its supreme state was while it was under the control of Nebuchadnezzar. When you read page 19 of your text, it tells you that Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 44 years and died within his 44th year, and that's in the year 561 BC. Is there anything else you want to add to the histories that are there? What spiritual thing did we learn about the nation of Babylon? We're on page 51. Page 51. And the second column, the first full paragraph, which says, putting all these thoughts together. Are we there? We're going to look at the second sentence, though. It says, each nation in the prophetic chain had some strong feature, and its history is recorded as an object lesson to the world. As in the days of its life, it had been an object lesson to the watching multitudes of other worlds. Babylon was an example of Satan's power to establish a religion which counterfeited the heavenly worship. The result was the basest form of idolatry, a fornication which makes her the personification among Bible writers of all vileness. So what's the spiritual symbology that is used to describe Babylon? Huh?
Vileness. False worship, yeah.
False worship. 51. Yes, please. And we are on the second sentence of the first full paragraph. It says each nation in the prophetic chain had some strong feature. Babylon was an example of Satan's power to establish a religion which counterfeited the heavenly worship. The result was the basest form of idolatry, a fornication which makes her the personification among writers of all vileness. So assigned to the nation of Babylon is false worship. Right? And that's why we still have 51, chapter 48. Yeah. So the rise and fall of Babylon. Babylon became notable in history starting 626/625. From 625 to 538 is 88 years. 70 years out of that 88 years was spent with Babylon being a premier nation. And all the descriptions that Nebuchadnezzar received in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 4 is typifying the glory years that Babylon enjoyed. But from those 70 years, Nebuchadnezzar shared 44 of those 70 years in ruling Babylon as a nation. And last class, we saw that in Daniel chapter 7, Babylon is described as a lion that walked on all fours, had eagle's wings, and it showed the speed at which it conquered various nations. And then as the vision developed, you saw where the wings were plucked and the lion began standing on hind feet, which is interpreted as the downward spiral that the nation started to go on since the death of Nebuchadnezzar. And when you read through the notes, you would have seen that that's what's being explained through that symbology. Anything else you want to add to this? So Babylon is spiritually associated with false worship. It began with a co-regency in 609. It ends with a co-regency in 539/538. It has 7 kings from its rise to its fall. And its fall is responsible to Media-Persia. Is there anything else we want to add? Or we're content with this skeletal history of the nation of Babylon? I'm content with it? Okay. What interesting information came out to you as we covered the nation of Babylon? Yes, Cheryl.
The marriage relationships.
What about it?
It's just interesting how, I don't know if I can explain it because I haven't read it for like a couple of weeks. But just how closely they were involved.
Or how marriage was used as a peace treaty between nations?
Okay, I think I found it on page 16. So, the seed of this alliance between Babylon and Media was the marriage of Antoneisha, the daughter of the king of Media, to Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar. And then you have the daughter of the king of Lydia to the son of the king of Media. So there's all these like ties of the nations.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to write it but I just thought it was interesting.
There is a section that tells you, when you read further down, that Nebuchadnezzar was brother-in-law to the Medes and the Persians, and yet he still sustained familial relationship with, it's like through the marriages, he was related to the other nations. He had relations to the other nations. I'm not sure where to locate it here right now, but that was a benefit for him during his reign as king.
His brother-in-law was the king of Media, I believe.
And there is also a use that Babylon makes of I would say politics, for lack of a better expression. When the nations of Media and Lydia were opposed to each other, there was an eclipse that Babylon knew about. Nabopolassar knew about it. But to attain world peace at that time, what he did was he used the fear that those people had of the eclipse to forge that marital relationship that Cheryl was sharing, all in the name of peace. But what I found about that action is that it's similar to the subtleties of Rome. That Rome utilizes sometimes not only the fears of the people, but it utilizes the various advantages it can get through various occurrences throughout the world just to acquire her own end. And I found that to be a similar history with Babylon. Another relationship that I found between Babylon and Rome is that it's the policy of Rome that you ally yourself with a nation, and after that alliance, you go against that nation. We see that through pagan Rome, and we see that through papal Rome. Pagan Rome allied itself with the king of the south, and through that alliance, he gained a particular power that he would not have gotten any other way. And as soon as he got that advantage, he attained to world dominance. Similarly with Nabopolassar, when he became king of Babylon, he utilized that opportunity to gain world dominance. It was that opportune position that allowed him to be the mastermind or the head of that kingdom that became supreme. And those are the two characteristics that I found was shared between Babylon and Rome. Any other interesting facts we found? Miss Cheryl was intrigued by the marriage relationships. Any other ones?
Scene. That's, I like that aspect of it.
Anything else?
The second paragraph where it measures the city, where it says that the city stands on a broad plain and is an exact square 120 furlongs in length each way. And I kind of drew a picture of it because it just for me highlights the counterfeit, because the God's kingdom is also a city four square, and you know, this greatness and this extravagance that Babylon always used to portray, and their pagan gods and things like that. But it just reminded me how much, there's always this counterfeit that will come to an end, and it did.
Yeah, and also ascribed to Babylon, this it says that it was the glory of kingdoms. So they had built it in a way where it was so beautified and had such grandeur that it would capture the imagination and attention of those in its time.
But you have to remember that Nebuchadnezzar said, "Look, this is what I made, this beautiful city."
I don't remember where I read it, but there's this particular account where it tells you in great detail how Babylon was structured. And the irrigation system that they utilized, it was far superior to that of those days. And what it did was that it provided air conditioning for the entire nation of Babylon. Just directing the waters of Babylon through, I don't remember how it was done, but it functioned similar to an AC unit when you how they went at doing it. And just the overall description of that nation, you can understand why it is represented as that head of gold, because it was far superior in technology, in design, to all the other nations that follow it. And one of the things about the image of Daniel chapter 2 is that when you look at if you look at it at face value, the metals that are there, they symbolize, they denote value and the diminishing of value. And when you go to the Iron Kingdom, you see a different concept being presented. What you see there is strength, and the iron is used to tell that nation breaks God's people. And that's the whole function of Rome. It's the persecuting power of the latter days.
One symbology I see in reading through the history of Babylon and understanding Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was not only a wise king, he was also a great builder. And the success of Babylon and its greatness was really dependent upon, or it is attributed to, Nebuchadnezzar. And you can see where he brought all this glory to Babylon, and he came to a place where he looked at all of what was there and his heart was lifted up, and he says he took all the glory to himself, and not realizing that it is not him in and of himself, because all the gifts that he possessed as a man were gifts from God. They were talents that came from the Most High, and all the abilities that he possessed and the wisdom to create such a wonderful place, it was not because of Nebuchadnezzar, so to speak, but it was from God. God was the one that gave him all that ability and taking glory to himself. And then I parallel that with Lucifer. He's looking at his beauty, he's captivated by all that God has made him to be, and then his heart is lifted up and he's taking all that glory to himself. Why is it that he is not, what he wants to take the glory? If you understand the picture that I'm trying to paint, just similarly, God allowed Nebuchadnezzar, he lifted up Nebuchadnezzar and placed him at a pivotal place in world history. Lucifer, the Bible says of him that he's the son of the morning, right? So God had placed him at a very pivotal place. He was the one in charge of the angelic host. And so the similarities are there when one is placed in a certain position. Is it that you allow the things around you and all that God has, right, to cause your heart to be lifted up, or will you humble yourself? So it's just that little parallel that I saw there.
And in the context of Nebuchadnezzar, God used the 7 times as the humbling mechanism to bring Nebuchadnezzar to his basis point. And when you look at Daniel chapter 2, Daniel, in response to receiving the interpretation of the dream, said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding." And when you read Revelation 17, it tells you that God put in the hearts of the 7 kings to be of one mind and to reign for 1 hour with the beast. So God is who is responsible for the overall affairs of history. And at the very beginning of our time together, we defined history as as philosophy, teaching by example. And we understood from what we covered that the philosophy is not a random philosophy. It's a divine philosophy that's running as a golden thread all through history. And God takes time to allow us to know the histories of these nations because they're of prophetic significance to us. There was a class that Parminder did recently, and he shared with us that the entire image from the head down to the feet is Babylon. And we built on that concept when we came together. If it's not last class, it's the class before. And we saw that in Nehemiah and Ezra, Cyrus and Artaxerxes are called kings of Babylon. And this, though we know them to be kings of Media and Persia. We looked in the text under Greece. There's a highlighted section that Olivine brought our attention to, where Alexander the Great in Babylon met with Rome during the height of his reign. It says history, page 45. Page 45. History may allow us to think that Alexander and a Roman ambassador did meet at Babylon, and that the greatest man of the ancient world saw and spoke with a citizen of that great nation, which was destined to succeed him to his appointed work and to found a wider and still more enduring empire. They met too in Babylon, almost beneath the shadow of Bel, perhaps the earliest monument ever raised by human pride and power in a city stricken, as it were, by the word of God's heaviest judgment, as a symbol of greatness apart and opposed to goodness. Apart from, and opposed to goodness. So even within the Grecian Empire, we see this usage of Babylon. And then we know that Rome in its papal phase is represented in Revelation 17 as Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. So throughout history, we can see where Babylon becomes somewhat of the golden thread, for lack of a better expression, throughout paganism. The concept of Babylon, false worship, runs throughout all these nations that are pictured in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. What other interesting thoughts did we get from our study of the nation of Babylon? We have the marriage relationships, the presence of Egypt throughout the history of Babylon, Babylon's dimension, counterfeiting God's kingdoms, God kingdom's dimension. Anything else? Cheryl?
The way that Cyrus took over the kingdom, I mean, they thought that they had enough, well, they did have enough provision, I believe, to sustain themselves for many years, and I don't remember how many years it was, but then Cyrus diverted the river. And that was pretty interesting.
Oh yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
He said it took 20 years.
For 20 years. I believe the amount of food they had.
Oh, I thought you meant the siege took 20 years.
No, not the siege. That's one of the things, one of the glories that Babylon prided itself in when Cyrus was on his way to
They had water
to
and
bring it
food.
down, was the fact that they were the city was so fortified and they had enough provision to last them many years. But I can't mark that now in our text. But piggybacking on what Cheryl shared, what happened here?
That's the same river that this horse died in.
So this sacred white horse drowned. And what did Cyrus do?
Punish the water.
He punished the water. How did he punish the water?
Diverted
No,
it.
that's Xerxes.
And he didn't wasn't it 38 ditches or something like that on the side?
Yeah, he divided it into trenches. I think it's 180 trenches, and sent it through.
300.
Yeah, so he marked out by ropes 180 trenches on each side of the river, and leading off from it in all direction, and setting his army to dig, some on one side of the river, some on the other. He accomplished his threat by the aid of so great a number of hands, but not without losing thereby the whole summer season. Yes, having, however, thus wreaked his vengeance on the Ganges by dispersing it through 360 channels, Cyrus, with the first approach of the ensuing spring, marched forward against Babylon. And what I like about that account is the usage of 180 and 360, and all these within context of a prophetic year. But what I found also interesting was that it was all providential. Had this not happened, the waters of the Euphrates would not have been dried up.
I think Uriah Smith writes about that the protection wall of Babylon were 100 meters high,
100 meters high.
300 feet, and three or four chariots could drive
Run
on top
along
of the wall
the
in one
wall.
direction or two directions.
300 feet tall, also.
It says on page 18. The surrounding wall was 350 feet high and about 80 feet thick on top.
What's the page?
Like 18, sorry, 18. Second paragraph. Page 18, second paragraph. Starts with the city stands on it.
What does it say there? How I
And
read
then
it?
The
says
city
it-
stands on a broad plain.
And then further down it says it was surrounded by a wall 350 feet high and about 85 feet thick at the top. And so that he said it enabled them to ride on their chariots around on the wall.
Not only did God predict who was to take Babylon down, but he also predicted that it would have been during an event, a celebrated festive event. When you look at Isaiah 21, it tells you that the men were drunken and they asked, "Watchman, what of the night?" That's the first reference you see of it in Isaiah 21. And there first you see the expression, "Babylon is fallen, is fallen." So God has taken care to delineate through the prophet Isaiah the histories that surrounded the fall of the nation of Babylon, long before that nation even began being a world dominant power. And it was overthrown by Cyrus, a Persian and Elamite. And following its fall, it was ruled by Darius, a Medianite. So the Medes and the Persians are who are responsible for the fall of Babylon. And Daniel, this is a side note, but it's important to see that in Daniel chapter 1 verse 21 it says that Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So the entire reign, the entire career of Daniel lasted up to the first year of Cyrus, which gives us understanding of Daniel chapter 10:1 and Daniel 11:1, right? That's just a side note. I find that it's sometimes hard to merge the idea that it was the third year yet first year, that concept. But the Bible gives us the answer. So the Medes and the Persians, we're going to look at them now. Your assignment was to look at some Bible verses. We're looking at the Medo-Persian Empire from a biblical standpoint. We always aim to allow the Bible to define our model as we proceed on. And your assignment was to look at Daniel 5 verse 31, all of Daniel chapter 6. You were to look to Daniel 9 is also needful because it happened within the ruling time of Darius the Mede. Ezra 4, 5, 6, and 7. Nehemiah 2, as Nehemiah 5 verse 14, 13 verse 6, Haggai 1, well, the entire book of Haggai, Zechariah 1 and 7, and the book of Esther. It tells you too that the word Medes is found 14 times in the Bible, and the word Persia is found 25 times. Media is found 6 times, 4 times in Esther, once in Isaiah 21 verse 2, and this is that prophetic section of Isaiah, one of the prophetic sections of Isaiah that tells us of the fall of Babylon, and it has media involved in it, and once in Daniel 8:20, right? When the ram is described as the kingdom of media. So let's recap what we learned from what we covered in our assignment. What does Daniel 5:31 tell us?
The kingdom of Babylon.
Okay. So it tells you the age of Darius when he became king of Babylon. He was 62 years. Daniel chapter 6. 120 princes.
Three princes.
123 princes.
No, there's 120 princes, and then there are three presidents.
Three presidents, of whom Daniel was the chief.
Yeah.
But what is the entire chapter of Daniel 6 speaking about? Okay, so the lion's den account of Daniel pictures was preceded by a death decree, which was a consequence of a confederation of powers, these 120 princes. And we can use Psalm 48, we had covered this, as a representation of 9/11, but within it, we see the principle of the kings confederating to go against God's people, which is typified in the history of Daniel. Daniel chapter 9 is still related to the reign of Darius. I'm sorry I never put it in, but we're well acquainted with Daniel chapter 9. It says, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realms of the Chaldeans. What happens in Daniel chapter 9?
Also, we see the prophecy of the 70 weeks.
Okay, good. It says in verse 9, verse 11. Ooh, pretty cool. Okay, in Daniel chapter 9, verse 11, it says, yea, all Israel have transgressed thy law, even by departing, that they may not obey thy voice. Therefore the curse is poured upon us, and the oath that is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, because we have sinned. And this is making direct reference to Leviticus 26. And this is all during the reign of this involves the history of the Medo-Persian Empire. Anything else about Daniel chapter 9?
Gabriel also appears to Daniel and explains the vision, interprets the vision.
Next reference is Ezra chapter 4. What did we learn from Ezra chapter 4? What do we learn in total from the account of Ezra and the Nehemiah? So let's not separate them. Let's blend both histories. It's the history of the decrees. Building of the temple, you said, Angelia? Anything else? The history of the decrees to rebuild the temple coming out of Babylon.
On the wall of Jerusalem?
Yeah. Hmm?
No, I was saying we also see if we have the stopping of the temple, we also see the finishing and dedication of the temple in 550. That's noted there as well.
Huh? You said what?
I'm asking if you had a debt decree here as well.
Yeah, I had it in relation to Daniel chapter 6.
Oh, but also in there a debt decree there where there was a plan to destroy the Jews.
Oh, you're in Esther.
Yes, Ezra and Nehemiah, right?
Yeah. But we're going to Esther. Haggai and Zechariah. What's so special about these two books?
Prophesying. And the foundation of the temple, or the something as far as general. I can't really think of it, I guess.
Repeat what you said.
Can't really think of it. I need to look.
Okay, so in Ezra chapter 4, we learn about this false Herodes that's named Artaxerxes here. But how we know that this Artaxerxes is not the Artaxerxes of chapter 6 and 7 is because this Artaxerxes stays the work of the temple while the other issues a decree, two decrees to two separate individuals, Nehemiah, and Ezra that lended to the rebuilding, the finishing up of the temple, no, the building of the temple, and the building of the streets and the walls. So that's how we know that this Artaxerxes is somewhat of a pseudonym for false Smyrnus. And Artaxerxes is just a mere title that some kings would take on to themselves. But it's similar to Pharaoh or Ptolemy. It's just a name that is carried on upon the desire of the king, if he so chooses to be so called. But then while the work is stayed, you go to Ezra chapter 5 verse 1, and it says, Then the prophet Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo prophesied unto the Jews that were in Jerusalem in the year of the God of Israel, in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. And they were the prophets responsible for the actions that preceded the second decree. Because then remember, if you go to chapter 6, it says, Then Darius the king made a decree, and search was made in the house of the rolls where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. And when you go further down in the chapter, you see where he tells them, the nations of that land that wrote to him, he told them to not interrupt the work. And whoever does that will be, their houses will be, the timber of their houses would be used to make a guillotine, and their whatever possession they had would be confiscated. Just paraphrasing what is there. So the events, what Zechariah and Haggai did was they stirred the people up to start building again. And when they started at that, the inhabitants of the land of Samaria came over and questioned what they were doing. And in response to that, wrote to Darius, told him to search the documents that were stored within Babylon. And upon doing that, he saw that what the Jews said about a decree from Cyrus was actually true. And Darius, in response to that finding, issued the second decree that allowed for the finishing up of the temple. And what Artaxerxes issued was a decree that lended to the finishing and building of the streets and the walls of Jerusalem.
You got on the board, but another key point is the work of the enemies in that.
Yeah, I wanted to write that. When did I want to write that? Here.
Probably stop building.
Yeah. So equal. Enemy. Gotcha. And then Mario was already ahead of us, and we're finally up to speed with him. We're in the book of Esther. What do we learn there? Besides the beautiful fact that it is a history that ties so perfectly with Daniel 11. Yes, so beautiful. I love the book of Esther. And Daniel 11. It's my favorite study. But besides that, what else about the book of Esther and the Medo-Persian history? This is what the Bible is giving us as history for the Medo-Persian kingdom. And we understand that Medo-Persia represents the United States of America in the context of a two-horned power. But something I want to insert quickly before the thought slips me is that the history of the decrees is a type of the three angels' messages. which allows us to see, and we already know it to be true, that tied to our two-horned power, or the United States of America, are the three angels' messages, which would be a parallel to the history of the decrees of to rebuild the temple. And we understand that on our line, there is a temple being rebuilt in the form of the church triumphant. So we have these correlationships based on the histories. If we overlap them, we will see many beauties from just the historical accounts that the Bible gives us. We see persecution, we see confederation of the nation, which brings us to Psalm 48, which we assign to 9/11. And the nation that's being judged there is or two-horned or type of Media Persia, the United States of America. We see that the account of the 7 times, Leviticus 26, the coming down of that divine symbol, all these things can be traced within our history, and they're all under the United States of America. So there is a correlation between what the Bible serves us as history and our prophetic understanding of what's happening within our time. So Esther.
Even the first verse, it just connects us right away to Daniel 11 and introducing, Greece, at least in its first stage, as far as what we're understanding about Greece now. And the whole plan, Ahasuerus is just trying to focus on taking down Greece and a small little entity he has to deal with. And right there in verse 1 is letting us know about that.
That military confederation that he had to plan how he would go against Greece. So
How do you connect this with Greece?
Because the actual
Esther 1 verse 1.
yeah, the reason he was gathering these kings was to deal with Greece, not the Alexander the Great Greece, because he wasn't on the scene yet, but
the realms
the
of
little
Grecia.
yeah.
It's not only verse 1, sorry. He has a hang up on just verse 1, but it extends up to verse 5.
Okay.
We do understand that the Ahasuerus is Xerxes of Daniel 11 chapter 2, that fourth king that we have it in our notes, and we'll cover that bit of history. But yeah, that military plan of Xerxes was quite interesting to me. One of the things that I found most interesting was the fact that he decided against going against Grecia because he thought that it would not have been feasible for him to do that. But he was basically talked into it, and having been talked into it, he already had what he needed. His father had already amassed the means, and where did his father go? Darius Hystaspes. Oh. So you have 2 Dariuses in the history of the Medes and the Persians. You have Darius the Mede. You have Darius the Persian. And he amassed all the wealth that was needful to go against 2 powers. He went against There was an Ionian revolt that received the assistance of the Athenians. And when you research the history, you see that the Athenians were the Greeks. Okay, so the Athenians were the Greeks of the European continent, while the Ionians were the Greeks of the Asian continent. So they were both Greeks. And when it was that they revolted, the Athenians helped them. And Arthur and Darius was like, who are the Athenians? And when he learned who they were, he had one of his, I think it was an archer, but just to be more general, he asked one of his servants each day at mealtime to tell him to remember his revenge against the Athenians. But both nations, this nation revolted first and the Athenians helped them. But Darius was unable to subdue I'm wondering. No. I'm wondering if Darius got to subdue the
Did Darius lead out the first attack?
Yeah.
The first attack was a failed attack.
It was a what attack?
The first attack was
Failed attack.
Yeah, failed. It was a naval attack, right?
No, I'm not talking that. I'm just trying to reconcile because in my mind I have a revolt with Egypt that Xerxes subdued.
Egypt
Yes.
and then Xerxes conquered.
So Darius dealt with the Ionians. I wanted to remember if he dealt with them before he died and was incapable, but I knew that after his death, he still had two nations yet to be dealt with. But I had Egypt here and I was questioning in my mind if it was actually so. But it's just a side note, but we'll cover this later when we go through the actual history. It says after this, we're on page 31.
It's not,
Darius the Median.
yeah, and not Xerxes from Esther.
And is not Xerxes from Esther. No.
It's the one who gives the second degree.
Yes. But he is father of the Xerxes of Esther.
Okay, got it.
And the Xerxes of Esther is grandson of Cyrus. And when we go to that history, we'll see that I think they're related through some very strange acts that they both have done. You know how we wrote that with the Gandhis, Cyrus punished the water? Well, Xerxes did similarly. But how, I think he added to it, he gave the water a couple lashes. And I found that to be a token of insanity, but they said that he was quite sane. I'm still questioning that. But on page 31, let's start with the first full paragraph. It says, there fell in this battle of Marathon on the side of the barbarians about 6,400 men, and on that of the Athenians 192. Such was the number of the slain on the one side and the other. Now, when the tidings of the battle that had been fought at Marathon reached the ears of Darius, the son of Hystaspes, his anger against the Athenians, which had been already roused by their attack upon Sardis, waxed still fiercer, and he became more than ever eager to lead an army against Greece. Instantly he sent off messengers to make proclamation through the several states that fresh levies were to be raised, and these at an increased rate, while ships, horses, provisions, and transports were likewise to be furnished. So the men published his commands, and now all Asia was in commotion by the space of 3 years, while everywhere as Greece was to be attacked, the best and bravest were enrolled for the service and had to make their preparations accordingly. After this, in the 4th year, 486 BC, the Egyptians, whom Cambyses had enslaved, revolted from the Persians. Whereupon Darius was more hot for war than ever, and earnestly desired to march an army against both adversaries. Now, as he was about to lead forth his levies against Egypt and Athens, a fierce contention, okay, this is good information. A fierce contention arose among his sons. Since the laws of the Persian was that a king must not go out with his army unless he appointed one to succeed him upon the throne. So that was a law in Persia. Darius, before he obtained the kingdom, had 3 sons born to him from his former wife, who was a daughter of Goberas. While since he began to reign, Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus, had borne him 4. Artabazanes was the eldest of the first family, and Xerxes of the second. These 2, therefore, being the sons of different mothers, were now at variance. And the end result of this controversy was that it was decided that Xerxes was more a rightful heir to the throne, him being born to royalty, while the other could not have been so because he was born into being a common man. So Xerxes was appointed. Let's read the last paragraph before I'm not going to read the paragraph that begins before Darius had pronounced. I'm going down. Darius, when he had thus appointed Xerxes his heir, was minded to lead forth his army, but he was prevented by death while his preparations were still proceeding. He died in the year following the revolt of Egypt, and the matters here related, 585. After 485, thank you, sorry. After having reigned in all 36 years, leaving the revolted Egyptians and Athenians alike unpunished. At his death, the kingdom passed to his son Xerxes. And this is needful information because Xerxes' history is captured, the bulk of it is captured in the book of Esther.
Just some dates for the revolt, and the Battle of Marathon was 490 BC. The Egyptian revolt is 486. Xerxes' reconquest of Egypt is 485 to 484. These also help. One of the reasons we find these so important to understand is they help us in the understanding of the event of midnight, right? You're probably going to get me, right?
Well, you can talk.
So, right, go ahead. Jump on it.
We're not going to do it today. Okay, being that we're already in Daniel 11, talking over the histories that preceded the battles of Raphi and Peniam, and how Daniel 11:2 is a type of those battles. One thought of interest that I would leave with you is that Xerxes, in the 6th year of his reign, that's when he went against the realms of Grecia. And the events that surrounds that is found, I don't believe I put it in this book, because I'm hopeful that through our coverage of Daniel chapter 11, we'll go into that history more detailedly, and to put it in the book would have taken a lot more page than you guys would have been comfortable with as having as a textbook. So when he returns home, I put his return in September/October, because when you read the book of Esther, it tells you that the virgins had to be prepared for a year in order for the marriage to happen. So one of the thoughts that I have is that, and it is as it is, Xerxes/Ahasuerus marries Esther upon his return from the battle of Raphia. And Raphia is a type, not Raphia, from the battle he had between his kingdom and the realms of Grecia, which is a type of Raphia. One thing I would want us to consider is that within the movement we have an internal application of the book of Esther. But when we allow the interpretation of Daniel 11:2 to remain as it is, we are forced to have an external application of the book of Esther. Xerxes or Ahasuerus cannot be Donald Trump while Esther is the church triumphant. It just does not spell sense logically. Neither does it spell sense prophetically, because it says that God has no dealings with the powers of darkness. So Xerxes, an external element, has to be married to another external element, so to speak. So one of the things I would love for us to discuss together is how we would externally apply the narrative of Esther based on our understanding of who Xerxes is from Daniel 11 chapter 2. And then we'll do a discussion on that. But the Bible, as a history for the Medo-Persian Empire, tells us in the places that we have covered, Daniel 5:31, Daniel 6, Daniel 9, Ezra chapter 4, 5, 6. Well, basically the entire book of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Esther tells us different snippets of the history of the Medo-Persian Empire. And one of the things that we have seen thus far through what we have covered is that all these events that are listed on the board can be seen in type in our history. The United States of America being a type of the Medo-Persian Empire. Next class, we are going to look at Medo-Persia from a historical standpoint, which will force us to go through the history of all the kings of that empire, from Cyrus all the way down to Darius. Let me just tell you the name of the last king. Hey. Okay. Darius Kodomanos. Darius Kodomanos was the last king of Persia. So we're going to cover the history that extends from Cyrus to Darius Oh, I read better in my head. So, when we look at the historical account of Medo-Persia, we will be looking at the histories that revolve around these two kings. The first and the last. And on that point, do we have any questions? Repeat that, please.
Where would you like our assignment?
Oh, that's pretty.
Oh, wow.
I'll collect that from you just now. Shall we pray to close?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many blessings in our lives that we can all be here together. We thank you that Antoneisha can teach us the history of Babylon and Medo-Persia, Lord. And I ask as we're studying that you'll sharpen our minds and our memories as we read, as we grow in knowledge, Lord, that we may apply this to our time and understand it. Be with us today for the rest of our day. Keep us safe, and may we have a blessed rest of the day. In your name we pray. Amen.